London, 1969. The city is the center of music universe. The Beatles have just recorded their last album. Led Zeppelin is shaking concert halls. The Rolling Stones own the radio. Rock and roll is king, and Britain is its throne. And then, from a rehearsal room in North London, comes a sound that nobody in that city has ever heard before. It's got the drive of rock, the freedom of jazz, the pulse of the Caribbean rhythms, and underneath all of it, running like a river through everything, is something ancient and irresistible. Something African. The band making that sound is a group of musicians from Ghana, Trinidad, Grenada, and Nigeria. Men who left their homes, crossed oceans, landed in the grey cold of London, and decided they were going to change music forever. Their name is Osibisa, and they did exactly what they came to do.
You feel so happy. Dance about the music. Music makes you happy.
To understand Osibisa, you have to understand the world that made them. Because this band did not come from one place. They came from many places. And that multiplicity was their genius. The story begins in Ghana, the first sub-Saharan African country to win its independence from colonial rule in 1957. Under President Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana became a symbol of African pride, African possibilities, and African modernity. There was electricity in the air, a sense that a new era had arrived, that African people could build, lead, create, and define themselves on their own terms. In that environment, a generation of musicians grew up soaking in everything: traditional Ghanaian music, the polyrhythms of the Akan people, the talking drums, the highlife dance music that had been evolving in West Africa since the early 20th century, mixed freely with jazz records coming from Americas and the rock and roll signals cracking on the radios from Britain. Into this ferment, Teddy Osi was born in Kumasi, Ghana in 1937. He grew up playing flute and saxophone, absorbing highlife, listening to jazz, watching the world change around him. Bright, restless, and musically hungry, he eventually made his way to London in the mid-1960s. Like many young Africans and Caribbeans who were drawn to their imperial capital in the post-war era, his brother, Mark Tonto, followed. A trumpet player of extraordinary talent, Mark would become one of the defining voices of the band they were about to build together. Then there was Soul Amafio, another Ghanaian, a drummer whose understanding of rhythms went far deeper than any rock drummer of the era. Soul didn't just keep time, he talked with his drum, layering African polyrhythmic patterns under everything the band played. From the Caribbean came Spartacus Ara, who was a bassist from Trinidad, and Wendell Richardson, a guitarist from Antigua whose playing could go from silky smooth to electrifying raw in the space of a single bar. These men found each other in London, in the pubs, the rehearsal rooms, the African and the Caribbean community spaces of city that was on the surface, welcoming, and underneath, deeply complicated for people of color. They were all excellent musicians. They were all far from home, and they all heard in each other the possibility of something very new, and they exploited all those possibilities within themselves.
I'm a big boy, mama. I know I never ever play with fire. Fire will burn you. And I now know better. You don't have to play with fire. Fire will burn you.
Before Osibisa, Teddy Osi had been playing in a band called The Comets, a highlife group that had some success on the London circuit but hadn't broken through. He knew the sound needed to evolve. He knew the music he wanted to make hadn't quite been invented yet. The key insights, the one that will define Osibisa, was this: African rhythm plus rock energy equals something neither had ever produced alone. This sounds simple now, but in the 1969, it was revolutionary. Rock music in Britain had borrowed heavily from American blues, which was itself descended from African music traditions carried across the Atlantic by enslaved African people. So in a very real sense, Osibisa was not adding Africa to rock. They were returning African sensibility to a music that had always carried it, whether rock audiences knew it or not. But Osibisa made that connection explicit. They brought it to the surface. They said, here is where this music actually comes from. Here is the roots. The band officially formed in 1969 with a lineup that was unlike anything the London music scene had ever seen before. 6 men, Ghanaians, Trinidadians, and Antiguans, later joined by Grenadians, all living in London, all building something together. They called the music they were making crisscross rhythms that explode with happiness. That phrase, their own description of their own sound, is one of the most accurate pieces of musical criticisms ever written. Because when you hear early Osibisa, that is exactly what it feels like. Rhythms that don't move in straight lines, but cross, intersect, and surprise. And underneath it all, an impressible joy. Not the manufactured cheerfulness of pop music, but the deep cellular joy of people playing music that connects them to something ancient and true. They began playing live at venues across London, building a following that was unlike any other band's audience. It wasn't just young black Londoners, though they were there at this concert. It wasn't just Africans and Caribbean expats, though they were definitely there. Osibisa drew in white rock fans who had never heard anything like this. They drew jazz heads. They drew students. They drew people who didn't know what category to put their music in. But they loved the music precisely because of that. It was not able to be categorized. Word spread fast. London's music industry was very small in 1969. And that when something good was happening, maybe in a rehearsal room in North London, people will hear about it because the news will fly real quick. In 1971, Osibisa released their self-titled debut album, Osibisa, on MCA Records. And if you have never seen the cover of that album, go look it up right now, because it's one of the most iconic pieces of album artwork in rock history. You can also see it on your screen. It was created by a young British artist named Roger Dean, who would later become famous for his fantastic artwork for the prog rock band Yes. For Osibisa, Dean painted a vision that matched the music perfectly. Magnificent elephants flying through a cosmic sky, free and powerful and utterly magnificent. These flying elephants became the symbol of Osibisa, The image said everything the band was saying in music. We are African, we are here, we are magnificent, and we are going somewhere. The music inside that album was unlike anything else in the charts in 1971. Tracks like Music for Gong Gong opened with traditional Ghanaian percussions and built into something that could shake a stadium. Ayiko Bia was a rhythmic explosion that made your body move before your brain had time to process what was happening. Follow C, yes, that is an actual track name, was a piece of rock jazz, African fusion that showcased every musician in the band at their peak. The album reached number 11 on UK Albums Chart. For a group of African and Caribbean musicians playing music that didn't fit any existing radio format, that was extraordinary. The music press was fascinated, if sometimes confused, because they couldn't classify the music itself. Critics struggled to find comparison. They were asking themselves, was this rock? Was this jazz? Was this world music? And at the time, the category world music barely existed yet as a commercial label. The answer was none of the above. And at the same time, all of the above. Osibisa were operating in a sphere they had largely created themselves, and the audiences responded with something more honest than critical praise. They responded with bodies. Osibisa concerts were not listening experiences. They were participatory events. People danced, people shouted, people were moved, in the most literal and physical sense of it that you can ever think of.
We give you our treasure, all our treasure. We give you our treasure, all our treasure. Be happy, yeah.
If the debut album Crack opened the door, the next 2 years kicked it off its hinges. Osibisa became one of the most in-demand live acts in Europe. They played festivals across Britain and the continent at a time when the festival circuit was the most important cultural proving ground in rock music. Glastonbury, the Isles of Wight, festivals in Germany, the Netherlands, Scandinavia, stages where the biggest rock bands in the world performed and where audiences were hungry for something they hadn't heard before. And Osibisa delivered every single time. Their second album, Woyaya, arrived in 1971, the same year as the debut, and produced what would become their signature song. The title track, Woyaya, is one of the most quietly devastating pieces of music of the entire decade. The word Woyaya comes from the Ga language of Ghana. It means, in rough translation, I'm not sure about this if it's correct or wrong, but it means, and I quote, "We are going. Heaven knows how we will get there, but we know we will." End of quote. Let's pause on that for a moment. Like a group of Africans and Caribbean men far from home in a foreign country making music that nobody quite knew what to do with it. Singing, "We are going, we don't know how, but we'll get there." It is a song about migration, about faith, about resilience in the face of uncertainty. And it is delivered not with despair, but with an almost transcendent calm. Voices harmonizing over a gentle swaying rhythm that feels like a ship finding its course in an open water. Art Garfunkel covered Woyaya, which brought the song to an enormous mainstream audience, but nothing compared to the original one. Woyaya became an anthem. It was played at protests, it was played at funerals and at celebrations. Through 1972 and 1973, Osibisa continued releasing albums. Heads in 1972, Happy Children in 1973, maintaining a pace of creativity that matched their relentless touring schedule. They were everywhere. They were unstoppable. They were consistently filling venues across Europe and drawing critical attention from every corner of the music press. And perhaps most significantly, they were doing it while sounding exactly like themselves. No compromise, no softening of their African elements to make the music more palatable for Western ears, no smoothing of the rhythmic edges to fit a radio format. They brought Africa to Europe on their own terms, and Europe came to them. Osibisa was able to conquer Europe, but Osibisa's ambitions were never limited to one continent alone. In Japan, they became remarkably one of the most beloved foreign acts of the early 1970s. Japanese audiences responded to the rhythmic complexity and joyful energy of Osibisa's live performances with an enthusiasm that rivaled anything seen in Europe. The band toured Japan multiple times, releasing their live recordings there that captured some of their most extraordinary performances. In Japan, they weren't an exotic curiosity. They were simply a great band, and Japanese music fans recognized greatness without needing a category to put it in. In the United States, the perception was more complicated, as often as it is. The American market in the early 1970s had tighter radio formats, more rigid genre boundaries, and a music industry that was, frankly, less adventurous than its British counterparts when it came to music that crossed cultural lines. Osibisa found audiences particularly in cities with large African and Caribbean communities, but they never achieved in America the kind of mainstream crossover success that they had in Britain and Europe. This is one of the quiet tragedies of their story. A band this vital, this innovative, this good should have been on every American radio station. That they weren't there tells you more about the American music industry of the 1970s than it does about Osibisa. But Africa, their home continent, embraced them completely. Osibisa toured across sub-Saharan Africa during the 1970s, performing to enormous crowds in Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, and beyond. These were homecoming concerts with particularly emotionally charged people, musicians who had left, who had gone to the Imperial Center and won, returning to triumph to show what they had built. The message their success sent to the generation of African musicians was electric. It simply meant that you do not have to abandon your musical roots to reach the world, because your roots are your power.
Everybody do what you're doing. A smile will bring a sunshine day. Everybody do what you're doing. A smile will bring a sunshine day.
Like every other story, no story of this length can travel in a straight line, and Osibisa's story is no exception. The late 1970s brought challenges. The music industry was shifting, disco was dominating the charts, punk was dismantling rock's old hierarchies, and the adventurous appetite for fusion and world music that had made Osibisa's early success possible was giving way to more compartmentalized taste. Lineups changed. Key members of the band departed and new ones arrived. The band recorded their later albums in the late 1970s and the early 1980s, and it was not as identical as they had made Osibisa and Waya Waya early on. And some of that original magic, that particular chemistry, was just harder to replicate with the new members that came into the band. There was also the structural challenge that plagued African artists across generations. The question of who controls music, who owns the recordings, who profits from the catalog. Osibisa, like many pioneering artists who signed to major labels in an era before musicians fully understood the implications of those contracts, did not always benefit proportionally from the success they created. Their story is, in this way, not just a story of triumph, It is also a story of the way the music industry then, as it still is now, they often extract maximum value from the artist while returning minimum reward. But here's what Osibisa never did. They never stopped. Through lineup changes and shifting trends, through difficult decades and ups and downs of the music business, the band continued. Teddy OC kept the name alive, kept performing, kept recording, pioneered in many ways by the path Osibisa had cleared, brought global sounds back into fashion. The music endured because great music always does. So what did Osibisa actually change? What is the world of music that exists because of what they did? First and foremost, the most directly, if we can put it like that, they helped invent Afro rock, and in doing so, gave African musicians permission to engage with Western rock on equal terms, rather than imitate the ones that were already existing. The artists who came after, from Fela Kuti's Afrobeat to Pan-African fusion of the 1980s and the 1990s, were building on the ground that Osibisa had broken. If we look at another point, they were critical in the creation of the world music market as a commercial reality. Because when record labels and music journalists started thinking seriously about African music as something with mainstream commercial potential, rather than anthropological curiosity, Osibisa's success was one of the data points that they were looking at, because you cannot tell the story of world music's global rise without their name in it. Teddy OC once said that Osibisa's music was about joy, not the shallow of joy entertainment, but the deep joy of a people expressing themselves fully and freely, without apology and without compromise. That joy crossed every ocean. It filled festival fields across Europe. It moved Japanese concert halls. It rang out across the continent of Africa in homecoming triumph. It lives in the DNA of every Afrobeats track, every Afrofusion collaboration, every moment when an African artist stands on a global stage and owns that stage completely. Osibisa flew, like those elephants on the cover, to places nobody expected them to reach, and they made it look magnificent. If you like content like this, please don't forget to subscribe, like, and also leave a comment. Thanks for watching, and see you on the next.
Music makes you feel so